share with you. And as was mentioned, I'll talk about some specific points. The title of my talk is Confronting California's Most Pressing Water Challenges, and lest I come across as a doomsday spokesperson, I will offer some suggested fixes to some of these looming challenges that we have.
Excuse me, I forgot to mention that everybody should know that we are taping tonight's meeting, and it will be, so just be aware of it.
Okay. Well, let me start with a little bit about statistics and geography. For purpose of this slide, I'd like to focus your attention just on the left slide, which talks about average annual runoff and derivatively precipitation in the state of California. I think in many ways this slide is self-explanatory. The bluer colors, the deeper blue, high precipitation areas, the yellow and orange, little rainfall. So I think this demonstrates that in a state as diverse as California, the vast majority of the precipitation falls in the north, that is north of the San Francisco Bay Area and in the Sierras Mountains, Sierra Nevada range. Whereas with the prominent exception of the Bay Area, where all you folks are joining us from, the population centers of the state are in Southern California. So we have a major disconnect between where the water falls, water and snow falls, and where the greatest demand for it is, both in terms of urban uses, what we call the urban uses, that is cities and commercial uses and industrial uses in the southern part of the state and the San Francisco Bay region. So as a result of that disconnect, that we have over the past 80 years, actually in a couple cases a little bit longer than that, in the last century, let's say, we've spent a lot of time, money, and energy coming up with means to transport the water from where it falls to where it is needed. And in this slide, you can see most of these delivery systems run roughly from north to south, with a couple of prominent exceptions. And actually, the first two major aqueduct systems to transport water from rural areas to urban areas are right where you are in the San Francisco Bay Area. At the beginning of the 20th century, the battle that John Muir fought and lost to try and prevent the plan by the city of San Francisco to dam the Stanislaus River in Yosemite National Park for water storage, and then building an aqueduct from the Hetch Hetchy Valley and a O'Shaughnessy Dam and the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, moving along this, I don't know if you can see it on this detail, but this green line heading to the Bay Area. And not to be outdone, the East Bay Municipal Utility District created its own system, initially with the McCollumney River, where you in the East Bay get most of your water from, diverted from the McCollumney River to the East Bay, and more recently, with the expansion of the population and additional need for water supplies, tapping into, well, the original plan of the East Bay Mud was to tap into the Lower American River to divert additional water that it had obtained water rights to transport that to the East Bay, but that precipitated a large legal battle that I played a minor role in, and ultimately, as you may well know, East Bay Mud negotiated a solution to divert its water from the Sacramento River south of Sacramento, after the Lower American River flows into the Sacramento River. But with those two prominent exceptions, the major systems run from north to south to provide water from the water-rich North and Sierra Nevada range to agricultural uses in the Central Valley, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley, and to Southern California, the major, largest urban centers. Well, the other thing is that I want to talk a little bit about agriculture. That in California, the vast majority of the water that's used for human purposes, human use in California, is used for agriculture. About 80%. That's designed to facilitate, irrigate, and make possible the nation's most robust agricultural industry. And I dare say it is an industry. We don't have many family farms anymore. That was the tradition in the American West, but it doesn't exist much in California or in most other states. But we do have a $2 trillion agricultural economy, and it's quite robust. But it is also, like other uses, environmental purposes and urban uses, dependent on a steady supply of water. And that is a serious challenge and problem because we are facing increasing frequency of droughts in California and increasing severity of droughts. But you can see 80% of the water used in agricultural regions, most of that is in the Sacramento-San Joaquin valleys and also the Imperial Valley. And I'm speaking to you from the Monterey Peninsula, and we have the Salinas Valley here as well. So it's a major industry. Let's talk a little bit more about drought in California. We have in California a Mediterranean climate. It's mild. It also means that we don't have precipitation year round. The precipitation, what we do get is clustered in the winter and early spring months. Every year, California has a worse drought than the eastern half of the United States has ever experienced. The other thing in California, we have tremendous variability from year to year in the amount of precipitation that we get. In recent years, we've experienced multi-year droughts. We had one in the mid-1970s. We had one of the most lengthy and severe drought in recent California history in 2012 through 2016. But water specialists and climate scientists will tell you through tree ring analysis that in the past, California has experienced, or what we now know as California, has experienced droughts of 100 years or more. And the other thing about California, the most diverse state in terms of topography, climate in the country, we have a lot of local variability. We have North Coast, which is perennially water rich. It's a rainforest area, in the only rainforest in the continental United States, and we have the driest deserts in the United States as well. I love to share this graph, which was presented to me by one of my colleagues, who's a water specialist, professor of hydrology at UC Davis. Don't worry too much about the statistics, but the takeaway message here is that east of the Mississippi, the eastern half of the United States, has very stable precipitation patterns. There's very little variability from year to year and very little drought situation. As you move past the proverbial 100th meridian, the drier western half of the United States, you see more variability. But where is the most variability in precipitation in the entire nation? Where we're living in the state of California. So this is a particular challenge for water managers, water users, for environmentalists. How do we provide for urban uses, our domestic uses, commercial uses, industrial uses, our agricultural needs, as well as environmental values in preserving our environmental resources when we have these wild swings in precipitation patterns from year to year? No place in the United States where that's more of a challenge and more of a problem than in California. This is a drought monitor. This is a regular publication of the federal government, various agencies that collaborate down here, NOAA, Department of Agriculture, and others. This one is at the very end of the 5-year drought that we had most recently, 2012 through the end of 2016. And you see how severe it was. Exceptional drought, the most draconian and alarming category maintained by federal government in central and southern California. Well, let's talk a little bit about climate change, starting with greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very recent update of what's known by climate scientists and others as the hockey stick graph. It shows changes in ambient concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 1,000 years. Climate scientists have been able to project back and forward. And over that 1,000-year period, you see a lot of variations up and down, but relatively constant. And then you get to the last 100 years. And what do you see? A striking increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and that's attributable to industrial uses, emissions from power plants, from all of our motor vehicles, everything else, and it is literally going to be off the charts very soon. So what's the impact of those increased greenhouse gas emissions? And it's not just carbon dioxide, methane, there are other greenhouse gases, but carbon dioxide is the most ubiquitous of those. And projected climate impacts in California of those, and I've highlighted the ones that are directly related to this talk. I've adapted, if you will, a slide that I use when I teach climate change law and policy, but with respect to water, increasing temperatures. I'll talk more about that in a moment, which means that we're going to have hotter, high temperature days, and the cooler days are going to be hotter than they were 20, 50, certainly 100 years ago. Faster snowmelt. Again, I'll talk about that. Most of our precipitation, our stored precipitation, comes in the form of snow, in the form of snow in our Sierra Nevada snowpack, and that is changing dramatically and not in a good way. As I'll and in terms of changing precipitation patterns, we're seeing more of our precipitation come down as rain, less as snow. That has a very alarming and deleterious impact on our snowpack, our natural reservoirs storage system, and more intense and infrequent precipitation, floods some years, drought in others, and finally going to a social impact. The impacts, these adverse impacts of climate change are already having, and will continue to have a disproportionate negative impact on disadvantaged groups, poor minority communities. And that's the issue of environmental justice, or in this case, water justice, is becoming an increased focus of debate when it comes to water issues in California. This is a slide I want to share with you. It's obsolete. It's no longer accurate. It pointed out, this was published in 2018, I believe, to end of 2017, to documenting the 10 hottest years on record for the United States. It shows that as of that time, 2012 was the hottest on record. Well, we just got the figures in we've now got data from 2018, 19, and 20. And the bad news is that we have a tie, the hottest 2 years in recorded history, 2018 and 2020, the hottest years on record. So there's a direct linkage between the increased amount of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere and the impact on warming of the planet, the nation, and the state of California. Taking a look at nationally here, I want to share with you 3 slides. These slides show what the highest ambient temperatures were in the nation, and averaging the figures between 1991 and 2010. So this is actual data showing days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And you just see in the Southwest, they're limited to the Southwest, I guess South Dakota barely, and Phoenix gets the Cupid doll during that period for the hottest urban areas, 92 days on average per year during this 20-year average, 20-year data set, 92 days where the temperature reached 100 degrees or greater. Dallas, Texas, 15. Through the projections of climate scientists, we're moving through time up to 2060. This is what the best climate scientists are predicting. And look at how those temperatures are changing and intensifying. And now we have urban areas around the country where we're experiencing over 100-degree days. Phoenix is now, by 2060, expected to have 132 days out of the year, temperatures over 100 degrees. West Texas, 101. Fresno, Central Valley, 72. Las Vegas, 112. What about the end of the century? And this is, again, a trend that is in many ways irreversible. We see even more draconian problems and affecting a greater part of the country. The Southeast, Atlanta, 39 days, Selma, Alabama, 74, Pecos again, West Texas, 142, Fresno, 101 days annually of temperatures rising 100 degrees or greater. So that's a source of some alarm. I mentioned I would talk more about snowpack. The Sierra Nevada range is our natural reservoir. In an average year, at least what used to be an average year, the Sierra Nevada snowpack stored as much water, Mother Nature stored as much water as all the dams and reservoirs made by humans in California throughout the state. And that was great because it provides, if the precipitation falls as snow and there's a snowpack, it slowly melts over the spring and summer months, and that's how we gain a lot of our water when it's most needed, particularly for agriculture in the spring, late spring, summer, and early fall months. Well, 2010 was pretty much an average water year. So what you're seeing here is what we at least used to think was a normal Sierra snowpack, important for water supply, also for recreationists, skiers in particular. 2016, this is the last year of that 5-year drought that we mentioned. Look at the snowpack here. And again, by way of comparison, same satellite photo. Taken, same location. To orient you, this is Lake Tahoe, this is Mono Lake in the eastern Sierra. This is a fraction. This is a mere fraction. So that natural reservoir that we rely on is shrinking and almost non-existent. Here's, again, the Sierra snowpack over a 30-year average in the late 20th century. And climate scientists are in agreement that the Sierra snowpack is going to continue to shrink on an ongoing basis. Here's the more optimistic projection is that by the year 2100, we will lose almost half, 48% of the Sierra Nevada snowpack as it existed in the last century. The more pessimistic climate scientists and forecasters think this is overly optimistic, that 2/3 of our Sierra snowpack is going to be lost. And that's going to have a profound impact on water supplies in the state of California. Among those effects is a lot of deleterious impacts on wildlife. A lot of the climate change that we're facing and that's already occurring is causing a lot of harm to a lot of species upon which we rely. Chinook salmon, most species of Chinook salmon are now listed under the federal and California State Endangered Species Act. Enormous commercial value, but also ecosystem value. Birds, these are California condors, just coming back from near extinction. And a particular concern to me living on the Central Coast, the iconic monarch butterfly if I could do a whole talk on the monarch butterfly situation, which obviously we don't have time for and is not what you asked me to speak about, but monarch butterfly population in California and throughout the United States and Mexico is crashing, absolutely crashing, in dire shape. The monarch butterfly could be headed for extinction. And speaking of headed for extinction, this is a Delta smelt. This is a small fish that traditionally inhabited the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta area. More about that in a few minutes. But it was commercially had some value for previously, but it is really what ecologists call an indicator species, the fish version of the canary in the coal mine. Its populations demonstrated the health or lack of health of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. It looks like, as of this year, the Delta smelt, which used to be in profusion in the Delta, is extinct. We can't find any of them in the wild. There's a glimmer of hope in the sense that my colleagues at UC Davis, fish scientists, have been running a semi-covert laboratory near Tracy, where they've been maintaining laboratory populations of Delta smelt, but it's uncertain whether they have a future in the wild. I mentioned the disproportionate impact of water issues and water shortages. This is an issue that was overlooked for many decades and really came to prominence in the middle of the throes of the 2012-2016 drought. This is This is a photo of East Porterville, California, in the southeastern portion of the San Joaquin Delta Valley, the San Joaquin Valley. And a lot of poverty in this area, low-income communities who rely on domestic groundwater wells for their water supply. Those wells ran dry, and even years after the drought has ended for most Californians, we have people in East Porterville and other parts of the Central Valley and Salinas Valley who are living in third world conditions, living off bottled water that has to be shipped into them. When they turn on the faucet in their homes, there's literally nothing coming out. Similar problem in East Porterville, largely Hispanic community, farm workers, low income. Native Americans, we have more Native American tribes in California than any other state. Most of them are impoverished and a lot of problems with access to sufficient water and healthful water, clean water in these communities. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that my law school, UC Davis, has created a few years ago a water justice clinic where law students train and work with lawyers to try and address these concerns and maintain or restore adequate and healthy water supplies for low and minority income communities. And here's a little more detail about that. Over the period of the drought, over 2,000 domestic wells ran dry, and many small water systems, particularly in the Central Valley, are in serious trouble. All right. You can't really talk about serious water issues in California without talking a bit about the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta, which is here. So it's due east of you good folks in the East Bay of California. And I'm just wondering, through a show of hands or a vote or whatever, how many of you have been to the Sacramento San Joaquin Valley, Delta, Sacramento San? So a few of you, but it's not surprising. There are a lot of people in the Bay Area who've never, other than maybe traveling on the edge of it on Highway 16 or Interstate 80, have never been to Delta, and it's definitely worth visiting. The historians tell us that the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta is the estuary. It's the largest estuary, estuary being defined as a mixture of salt water and fresh water. It's the largest estuary on the west coast of either North America or South America. It is also the confluence of the Sacramento River, the biggest river in California, running from the north to the south, and the San Joaquin River flowing northward up through the San Joaquin Valley, and they meet here. Historians tell us that before California became a state, the entire Central Valley, 600 miles long, about 150 miles wide, running from Bakersfield and the Tehachapi Mountains in the south all the way to Redding and Red Bluff in Northern California, was a big, huge wetland area and marsh. That has changed. As a result of development, a lot of this area was, quote, reclaimed for what was deemed in the 19th century to be productive use. Back then, folks didn't think, decision makers didn't think that what we now think of as wetlands were worth anything, that indeed they were a detriment, that they were malarial swamps, only good for communicating disease. And that they needed to be put to productive use by being drained and used for agriculture or human settlement. Well, that's changed dramatically. This is an aerial oblique view of what the Delta looks like today. It has been reclaimed, levees placed around the periphery of what are now islands. We have about 40 islands in the Delta, most of which are used for agriculture, as seen here. We have a few developments. This is a marina here. This is looking, I believe, north towards Sacramento. But you get a sense of what the Delta looks like now. The Delta, if we can turn to water issues and water conveyance, movement of water. Remember that early slide I was talking about, the water being in the north and the people being in the south, and how do we get the water from the water-rich north to where the people need it to the south? Well, we built not one, but two major water conveyance systems. The federal government, starting in the 1930s as a New Deal public works program designed to employ people and help us get through the Great Depression, started what construction on what has come to be known as the Central Valley Project. And Shasta Dam near Red Bluff, California, at the north end of the Sacramento Valley, is the heart of that Central Valley Project, Shasta Dam. And that's the major reservoir on the Central Valley Project. The state counterpart, the State Water Project, state system, was built in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s, and its centerpiece is Oroville Dam and the reservoir behind it. So these are the two largest storage systems, one for each system, the federal system, Central Valley Project, and the State Water Project. Well, the water is released over time, so it's a managed environment. So we don't have free-flowing rivers for the most part anymore. Certainly not the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. They're heavily dammed and heavily managed. At the south end of the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, and I think I've got another slide showing a detailed map, are pumping stations. And again, we have two pumping stations, one for the federal system and one for the state system, that suck water through the Delta and put into aqueducts to send it farther south. And it is this pumping system that have really wreaked havoc with the natural ecosystem of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And the third component are the aqueducts, the channels that move the water south from the two pumping stations. And again, we have parallel systems here. We have the Delta Mendota Canal is the main aqueduct moving the federal water project, Central Valley Project water from north to south. And in the State Water Project, we have what is known as the California Aqueduct. And if you most of you, I'm guessing at some point have driven down I-5 south and you pass over and alongside both of these aqueducts, you see them up close and personal. Well, the problem with this system that seemed to make sense, at least to water engineers in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that it has provided a reasonably reliable system of water conveyance through the Delta, but it has, as I said, just wreaked havoc with the natural system. So the water, these pumping plants at the south end of the Delta are so strong, so powerful, that they reverse natural flows. And migratory fish species and others get totally disoriented. That's at best, and at worst, they get sucked into these pumps and get, the polite word for it is entrained in the pumps. They get sliced and diced and killed. And that is what has been the unhappy fate of the Delta smelt, but also a lot of commercial species like steelhead trout and salmon species. So one of the proposals that has been around in one form or another since the 1960s has been to move water from the Sacramento River, which is the largest river system, as I said, in California. And instead of pumping it through the Delta and sucking it south, moving it around the Delta. Originally, in 1980s, was a proposal to build what is known as a peripheral canal around the east side of the Delta and connect up to these pumping stations. That actually went on, the legislature passed that proposal in 1980, I believe, in 81, but the voters led by you folks in the East Bay and in Northern California got a referendum on the ballot, which nullified the peripheral canal bill. So that didn't happen. Former Governor Jerry Brown, who generally gets high marks for his environmental policies, nonetheless has morphed the project into what was originally a twin tunnels project to build an underground subterranean tunnels to transport water from the Sacramento River underneath the Delta to the pumping plants. That has not generated much more enthusiasm, certainly not by the Delta farmers who rely on freshwater supplies. They're very concerned, these communities in the Delta, that if either of these projects happen, that their water quality will degrade and they no longer will have adequate water or fresh enough water to irrigate their crops. To add another problem to this issue, one that is somewhat less publicized, is that the levees that I talked about, let me go back a couple slides. There we go. To dry out these lands and make them suitable for production. These are earthen levees. These are not Corps of Engineers, concrete, highly engineered levees. These were levees built by hand in the late 19th, early 20th century. They're very fragile and not terribly secure. To make the problem even worse, the land here has subsided. It is dropped, and in many cases, the surface of these islands is 20 to 30 vertical feet lower than the water level that you see here. And hydrologists will tell you that puts enormous pressure. That water wants to find a lower level. So it's I have colleagues at UC Davis who are saying that this levee system is destined to fail. It might take our next earthquake. It might be, we've had some recent levee breaches on bright, sunny summer days. And if enough of these levees fail, your San Francisco Bay water is going to, salt water is going to rush in here and contaminate, at least in terms of both water for irrigation, but equally important for drinking water supplies, domestic water supplies, on which 22 million Californians rely for some of their some or all of their water, for water that is pumped through the Delta currently through the state and federal water projects. And if that happens, that is that's a game changer. That is can you imagine over half of the state's residents from one day to another suddenly losing their fresh water supplies, and what the effect is going to be on 22 million Californians and everything that they depend on. All right, so what do we do about fixing the Delta? It's a major problem, and it has been debated, as I say, for at least as long as those water projects, the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, were a twinkle in a water engineer's eyes beginning in the 1930s. The water conveyance system has worked reasonably well as a water conveyance system. As I said, it has done tremendous damage to the ecosystem that is or was the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. So we are the State Water Resources Control Board, which regulates both water quality, water pollution, and water supply in the state of California, has been under the unenviable role of trying to fix this system that's been in place, this water infrastructure that's been in place. And currently, there are negotiations underway. The Water Board and Governor Newsom have urged the so-called stakeholders, that is agricultural users, urban water districts like East Bay Mud, like the Metropolitan Water District in Southern California, and environmentalists to negotiate a solution. And those negotiations are not going smoothly or well. The question is, if those negotiations break down, or if they don't come to fruition, it'll be left to the State Water Board to make a decision. And if the Water Board doesn't act, or if it acts in a way that any of these stakeholders believe is inadequate or improper, we head over to the courts, and the courts will be called upon to resolve this. And general purpose judges are not really in the best position to deal with these difficult questions of ecosystems, ecology, water quality, and water engineering. But that's the current state of play in Sacramento in terms of what to do about the Delta. Lest I leave you with just a whole series of problems that you can despair over or worry about, let me try and end my presentation on a more positive note. What are some of the ways out of our looming water crises? And not crisis, crises, plural. First and foremost, the easiest way to create new water supplies is by conserving what we have. California and Western states generally have not been nearly as proactive in perfecting and utilizing water conservation methods than many other nations around the world. But we're starting to, everything from low flow toilets and shower heads, drip irrigation systems that are far more efficient in irrigating our crops, stormwater recapture to recycle water. Hopefully we can do better than in California. Up until about 3 years ago anyway, California was using recycled water for 1% and only 1% of its urban water uses. We can and absolutely have to, in my opinion, do a lot more and a lot better. A lot of water districts, the so-called water buffaloes, say, well, we just need to build more storage. We need to store more water. Here are two current proposals by water engineers and water districts, private and public. This is Shasta Dam, another aerial view of it. And there's a proposal to vertically raise Shasta Dam by 15, 20 vertical feet to increase the storage. That makes a lot of people unhappy, especially the Native American tribes whose ancestral tribal lands would be inundated if that occurs. The other option is to build new reservoirs and transportation systems. This is a artist's depiction of the proposed Sites Reservoir. This would be a new so-called off-stream reservoir in the northern Sacramento Valley, where water would be moved from the Sacramento River to be stored here in this reservoir. Unclear to me whether this will ever be built. The problem for the water districts and the water companies, agricultural like Westlands and urban like the Metropolitan Water District, is that all the good and cost-effective reservoir sites have already been developed. Doing new ones in these more marginal areas is going to be tremendously expensive. Unclear whether they pencil out. So it's not surprising then that most of the people who are arguing for new storage projects want to have Uncle Sam or the state of California or anybody else pay for it. So that's a problem from their standpoint as well. More positive and productive approaches is to make better use of the water that we have. Well, I haven't talked about groundwater that much. In a normal water year, in a normal year of average rainfall, California derives about 40% of its water for human use from groundwater aquifers. In a time of drought like we had 2012 through 2016, that percentage goes over 50%, as much as 60% of our water coming from groundwater aquifers. The problem is of doing that, it's like overdrawing your bank account. The groundwater has been perceived by many water users, particularly agricultural users, as their rainy day account, their checking account that they can draw from when they need it. That doesn't really work over the long term, and groundwater aquifers, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, are chronically overdrafted, also in the Salinas Valley where I live. Remarkably, until 2014, California was the only Western state that didn't have a statewide system of managing and conserving its groundwater resources, even regulating groundwater extractions at the state level. That changed in 2014 because of these problems of overdrafting, land subsidence, domestic wells going dry that I discussed. And so we now have this Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I don't have time to get into that now. If you have questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it. But hopefully that will, the whole goal here is to make our groundwater aquifers sustainable, not to pump out over the long term more water than goes in. But I want to talk briefly about conjunctive use. The idea is to manage our surface water supplies and our groundwater supplies conjunctively together. So when we have a wet year, particularly wet year, we can allow our underground aquifers to refill either by natural seepage into the groundwater aquifer or by active pumping to fill the aquifers, and use that as our storage. Using our groundwater aquifers as additional storage, to me, makes a lot more sense, is a lot more cost effective and a lot less environmental damaging than building new dams, surface dams and reservoirs. And then in times of drought, then if you have sustainable full aquifers, you can pump them and use them as your proverbial and literal rainy day account. Well, some people say, well, let's create new water. Can we do that? And the answer is yes. The technology is there through desalination plants. Many parts of the world, in the Middle East in particular, arid regions use desalination plants quite effectively. California has the largest desalination plant in the Western United States. This is in Carlsbad, just north of San Diego. $1 billion project. Actually, this is a decommissioned electrical generating facility. This was the desalination plant in construction. It is now operating and providing about 20% of the city of San Diego's, in the San Diego metropolitan areas, urban water supplies. Desalinated water, it's more expensive currently than other water. I have come to the view, not shared by a lot of my fellow environmentalists, environmental friends, that the current technology for desalination is able to overcome some of the earlier first generation problems of entrainment of species and other problems. When I took a tour of this facility, I spent a day here. I was quite impressed by what they were doing. It's a little bit analogous to the first generation of wind turbines were very damaging to bird life and particularly to raptors. The second and third generation wind turbines are much more wildlife friendly. Similar pattern, I think, existing here. Final slide, I think, is in terms of water politics. There are really three main groups that for the past, certainly as long as I've been following this stuff for a half century or longer, that are the enemy combatants, at least periodically, when it comes to water use, how much we consume, how much we leave in place, how much we devote to urban, agricultural, and environmental uses. And these are the players that are actively involved in those voluntary agreement negotiations over the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And traditionally, it was the urban users, urban water districts, and the agricultural districts like Westland, who together were able to use a political term, roll or overwhelm politically environmentalists, environmental organizations, and environmental needs. That has changed in recent years, and we see more often than not environmentalists partnering or aligning themselves with urban uses, urban water districts, and looking rather covetously at the 80% of human used water that's being used by agriculture, that maybe we need to irrigate more effectively, more efficiently. Maybe we need to fallow some lands to free up water for both the environment and our growing population, 40 million. So keep that in mind. The water politics will remain important and contentious. And the last thing, I'm teaching water law this semester, and my students are probably getting tired of me saying that we have in California a very antiquated system of water rights. In California, we tend to pride ourselves in innovation, and in areas like climate change policy, we've been leading the nation and the world. Not so much with respect to our water laws, how we allocate our scarce water laws. And our system is terribly antiquated. In times of drought, we don't have a nimble system that can move water around and protect our environment and require rationing when necessary or allocation. We've got to fix that. That's a long-term problem. And I'm working on with a group of people that's proposing some reforms to the legislature on that score. So with that, I will stop talking, and I don't think we've gotten any questions so far, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have on any of the topics I've covered or any area of water policy, whatever you want to talk about.
As we've gotten a few questions, Jeanette, do you now see them in the chat?
Yeah, I now see them, yes. I think that maybe Gail has a couple of different questions that might be useful for her to present, or should I read them out, Gail? I think she's muted.
Yes, please, you go ahead.
Okay. So she agrees, of course, conservation is most important. Yes, on desalinization. Is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta committed to equal measures of water reliability and ecosystem restoration, so fish are considered as much as water for other uses?
No. The short answer is no. I wish that were not the correct answer, but I'm afraid it is. And even after the rise of the modern environmental movement, which I peg at about 1970, and the torrent of new environmental laws at the federal and state level, no, I think that's been a real problem for environmentalists and the ecosystem, that they don't have an equal place at the proverbial table. That there are some leverage points, and the state and federal Endangered Species Acts are, I think, the best example of that, and they're utilized by environmental groups more often than not to halt environmentally damaging water projects or diversion levels. But as I think it was a number of people put it, the Endangered Species Act is a slender reed on which environmentalists can tend to pin, because the Endangered Species Act is the emergency room of environmental law. It only kicks in and only takes effect when a species, a plant or animal species, is circling the proverbial drain, like the Delta smelt. And what I think we need, and most environmental policy folks believe, we need a more proactive system of environmental laws that keeps species off the endangered species list. And when it comes to water policy, gives the environmental interests an equal spot at the table here, and whether it's negotiating voluntary agreements or any number of environmental issues. And this is going to be a bigger problem, because not to put too fine a point on it, but what we're looking at with climate change is a shrinking amount of available water at a time when population continues to increase. So we can blunt that with more intensive conservation measures, but in point of fact, there's going to be less water to go around prospectively. So this issue is going to get worse, and environmentalists and environmental organizations need to become more successful in this ongoing debate, in my opinion.
So one of the things that I think is probably also a problem in the environmental things of this sort, where you worry about the fish in the Delta, but you have to remember that if you don't worry about the fish, then you also don't have any birds.
Yep.
And then it goes on to, all the other things that are all interconnected.
Yeah, well, the Pacific Flyway goes through the Delta, so you've got migratory waterfowl too. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Let's see. What about the handling of the influx of microplastics in our water system?
Oh boy, that's a whole nother lecture again. And plastics in our waterways has gotten much more research done, and I think much more publicity. And I think policymakers are far more focused on it in the ocean environment, where we have these garbage patches. But micro particles are becoming endemic to our freshwater and saltwater environments, and it's a huge problem. And it's one that, again, I don't think policymakers have dealt with in any systematic ways in California or anywhere else in the United States, for that matter. I don't know for a fact how effective or ineffective other nations have been. We have not done much on the microplastic front, and it is another ecological ticking time bomb.
So then Tricia has a question about agriculture.
Yes, hi, Trish Gorman, originally from Monarch City, Pacific Grove. My question.
That's where I'm speaking to you from. I just went to the butterfly sanctuary there on Friday of last week and didn't find a single butterfly.
I know. That's why I mentioned it, because you had that as one of those species that we're losing. I'm on the League of Women Voters of California. I don't know if you can see me or not.
Yes.
League of Women Voters of California Food, Soil, and Agriculture Committee. And I wondered if there is any solution to scale with changing agriculture practices, no-till, planting ground cover instead of leaving fields fallow and soil bare. If there's anything, there's a movie I think a lot of us have seen, Kiss the Ground, about this subject. So I've been looking at these issues, but I don't, with the scale of the problems you have outlined, I don't know if these kinds of changes in agricultural practice will be enough to possibly reverse some of the damage we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know either. And the fact of the matter is that of all of the industries that have come into contact with the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the other statutes that I've mentioned, um, in many ways, agriculture, including big agriculture, has gotten a pass from most of those laws that other industries are required to comply with. So most of the reforms that you've seen in agriculture have been self-generated in order to save costs, or in some cases to maximize finite water supplies, but they haven't been mandated by government regulators at the federal or state level. Query whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but they have a very powerful lobby, and you can count on them to be very resistant to being told what kind of agricultural practices they're going to be required to use.
Yeah, so far there are federal Farm Bureau people going out trying to train the farmers about how they can actually save money. So maybe the profit motive will help. But I just wondered if there was any larger, I guess not at this point. Hopefully that can kick in as another solution.
That would be a great development, but yeah, on a snapshot basis, I don't see much of that going on, unfortunately.
Is it something that you could be a policy that might encourage it?
I'm sorry?
Is there some way to have policies that might encourage it?
Sure. I think the best thing that could be done would be, and again, agriculture in California is a particularly potent political force, somewhat with former Governor Brown. I think Governor Newsom, from the day he took office, has been more solicitous of agricultural interests than Governor Brown was. And that's an issue. But I think if I were Emperor King of California, or if I were governor, the first thing I would do would be bring together a group of folks, including agriculture, but also from the environmental community and scientists, and ask them to come up with a set of recommendations to deal with to what the necessary reforms are and how they should be implemented, and then give them to the legislature, because I don't think the legislature or the governor or the governor's office has the ability to focus on this in the first instance. The people who are closest to the ground, whether they're environmentalists or agricultural folks or water engineers, whatever, have the expertise. And if they came up with some deliberations that led to some concrete suggestions, I think they would have a much better chance of resonating with political decision makers in Sacramento.
So Nancy Bickle has written, how effective can recharging groundwater be when there has been substantial subsidence and so little spaces where water could be stored have disappeared?
Well, yeah, that's a problem, of course. And the thing is, groundwater aquifers are not monochromatic. They have different geologic characteristics, and some of them have structural integrity. So even if they're overdrafted, they are just empty, and they can be refilled. Other groundwater aquifers are fragile, and if the groundwater is extracted, they collapse and compress. And those groundwater aquifers that have those characteristics are not good candidates for groundwater recharge, because the storage capacity underground, the aquifer, is largely reduced or even eliminated altogether. So you have to focus on the more structurally strong groundwater aquifers for purposes of a comprehensive recharge effort, it seems to me. Not all, but you raise a good point. Not all groundwater aquifers are suitable candidates for that.
Let's see, Ross Johnson, regarding agriculture, I seem to recall the planting of water-intensive crops during the drought of the 2010s, particularly almonds. In the interest of demand shifting supply, is there something we shouldn't be buying? Less dairy, pistachios versus almonds?
Well, you know, that raises a good point. I will let me talk about that briefly, and if I don't answer the question to the questioner's satisfaction, I'll try again. You know, for many years in places like the Imperial Valley, the southeastern corner of California, one of the most arid parts in the entire nation, the inhabitants of the Imperial Irrigation District were growing alfalfa and cotton, low value row crops. And does it make any sense to grow in a very arid, hot environment, row crops, inexpensive row crops to grow alfalfa, which is, you know, feed for dairy cows, for example? In the abstract, that makes no sense to me at all. But it also made no sense to a number of agricultural interests who are moving from those row crops to higher value crops, which take the form of orchards and vineyards, wine grapes and almond orchards and olive orchards, and you name it, which in a sense is a better use of agricultural lands, except for one major problem. If you're in a drought and you have row crops, you can let your land go fallow during the drought and not plant anything. If you have almond orchards, you've got to irrigate them in dry years and wet years. So by this conversion that we're seeing throughout the Central Valley, Sacramento, San Joaquin Valley, to more expensive crops, orchards and vineyards, you're really locking in water demand for that 80%, and you lose some of the flexibility to fallow fields in drought years. So that's pros and cons. Whether, to get back to the specific question, I guess if you want to boycott almonds, feel free, go for it. But the problem is the vast majority of California's almond crop, and California is the largest grower of almonds in the nation, maybe in the world, I don't know. 80% of those almonds get exported to other countries.
Ross, would you like to expand on the question?
I'm sorry, was that directed at me?
No, I was asking the person who asked the question. He didn't respond. So I think we'll continue.
Asked and answered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Jinky says, could planting more crops need lead water help? Oh, maybe crops that need less water help.
Yeah, they're increasingly sophisticated and efficient irrigation techniques, and using computers, and a lot of large agricultural districts are doing this. This is actually where the agricultural big ranches and farms have an advantage over the family farms and ranches, which are themselves an endangered species, that at least they have the money to buy this technology and apply and install it. Yeah, there's increasing technology and use of computer and databases, and I'm getting way outside of my expertise at this point, where you can grow the same amount of agricultural products with a fraction of the water supply. And those devices keep getting better, more efficient by the year.
Sounds like another thing we should encourage. Carol, you have questions?
I do. One is, in all this talk about water, you didn't mention fracking. Fracking, as I understand, uses a great deal of water. Is it as great a problem today as it was? And what's the effect on our water supply and for fracking?
Well, it's a big problem, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, where there are substantial oil reserves. It's less of a problem in the Sacramento Valley, north of the Delta, and other parts of the state. But fracking is the quote gift that keeps on giving, in the sense that what has made fracking successful from an engineering standpoint is this kind of devil's brew of chemical components. It's not just water, it's various chemical components that are injected under high pressure underground in an effort to fracture whether it's oil reserves or natural gas deposits. And the problem is I don't believe there are any consistent ways to ensure that those fracking materials, those chemicals that witches brew, is ever extracted and cleaned up. So that just adds to subterranean contamination of our groundwater aquifers, or at least some of them. That is a problem that hasn't been terribly well addressed. I think so that contamination is going to continue until the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act finds a way to require that it be cleaned up, which is going to be expensive if it can be done at all. Long range, as California weans itself from fossil-based fuels to renewables, hopefully this won't be as big of a problem going forward, but we are going to have a fracking legacy, I'm afraid, for some time, and not a good one.
And I had another question, which was more general, but what has been, to go to the national government, what has been the biggest cases for the Supreme Court, and what do you predict the new Supreme Court with the 6-3 majority we have will do for environmental law for the next couple of years?
Well, I think we're going to see a rightward turn when it comes to environmental law and cases. And we're going to get some early indications. There's a very interesting property rights case that comes to the U.S. Supreme Court from California. And it actually involves a nursery. It's a labor dispute involving the California Agricultural Labor Relations Board, and whether private companies that are subject to regulation by the ALRB must allow labor organizers on their property to meet with their workers or solicit new union members. And this nursery, Cedar Point Nursery in the San Joaquin Valley, I believe it is, has challenged that as saying that ALRB requiring me to provide access to labor union representatives on my private property constitutes an unconstitutional taking of my private property for which the government needs to pay compensation. That case is on the docket for this term. It'll be decided by the end of June, and that will go part of the way in showing us just how conservative this 6-3 lineup is going to be. The other thing, though, and again, these are very preliminary returns on the Supreme Court, it seems like this group of conservatives, or what we think have been labeled conservative justices, are not as monochromatic and unified as they were back in the days of Scalia and the conservatives of the 80s, 90s, and first decade. They've already seen some splintering and some surprising voting patterns. So it may not be, from an environmental standpoint, quite as dire or as bad as some of the early predictions were. But it's too early to tell, is the short answer to your question. We'll know a lot more a year from now.
So then, following on from that, Gustavo has a question about what are some of the water issues that you can see the new administration could tackle in the future?
Okay, well, sure. I guess the glib answer, but I think it's accurate, is I've seen encouraging signs from the Biden administration to unwind what I would call the anti-environmental policies of the previous administration over the past 4 years. And I'll give you one concrete example of that tied to what I was talking about: the coordination of the state water project and the federal Central Valley project. For many years in Republican and Democratic presidential administrations, there'd been a strong commitment to coordinating the operation of those two systems, the state water project and the federal Central Valley project, with one another. And so to operate them really as a unified system as much as possible. And that makes eminent sense to do that. The Trump administration turned its back on that tradition, as it did in so many other traditions, and basically went its own way and made it clear that it saw the purpose of the Central Valley Project to provide just as much water to agricultural users as it could, to the detriment of urban uses and to the environment. So the Biden administration early signs suggest that that it is moving away from that to a more benign and balanced approach to management of the federal Central Valley Project, which is good news at any number of levels. I think you'll also see a more balanced interpretation and application of the Federal Endangered Species Act, which is, as I say, probably the most potent weapon that exists in federal law in terms of preventing bad projects from going forward. Another thing that's a little bit more wonky is that, you know, for many years, these water contracts, the federal Central Valley Project would give contracts to water districts, particularly rural agricultural water districts, 40-year contracts, guaranteed water supply. The Trump administration, thanks to a little notice law passed by Congress, I believe in 2016, made a number, or attempted to make a number of those water contracts permanent, that is ongoing and open-ended, an obligation to provide water. And in a time where, as I'm saying, shrinking water supplies, increasing drought episodes, to give guaranteed water supplies to agriculture at a time when we need to, we need to be use more adaptive management tools and make sure that in times of drought that everyone bears an equal part of the burden. That's just crazy. And happily, from my subjective perspective, a number of Native American tribes have sued the Trump administration to challenge the conversion of those water supply contracts from the Federal Water Project from 40 years to permanent. I think that hopefully the Biden administration, which is the defendant, inherited that case, will settle that case on more favorable terms. And if anything, those 40-year contracts ought to be made shorter term or subject to revision on real-time basis when drought conditions require. So that was I think a particularly ill-advised policy move by the Trump administration, and one that the Biden administration hasn't gotten a lot of publicity, but I think in California and the arid southwestern US, that's a really important policy change it needs to make and embed in federal water policy.
So related to that, there also used to be, I don't know if it still is, a public water storage area in the southern part of the Central Valley, which I believe may have been auctioned off at some point. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if this relates to water marketing, which is a whole different topic, and whether water is a public resource or whether it ought to be a private commodity that can be moved around. And that's, again, we don't have time to talk at length about that tonight, but the reservoir that you're talking about, I have vague recollection somewhere in the San Joaquin Valley, there's a reservoir that was intended for that purpose, to use the technical term, to wheel water from one user to another by using water markets. But I don't think that project has not, to the best of my knowledge, gotten off the ground yet.
Okay. And Ruby has questions. She says, people don't seem to realize how effective conservation can be in making the most of the water we have. For example, LA was able to get along with the same amount of water use over a recent period when the population increased threefold. What do you suggest to promote conservation?
I think we need a public relations campaign, and I think other parts of the world, and I'm looking mainly at the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, enemy disputants from a political standpoint, to be sure, but out of necessity has come a lot of water conservation efforts. More recently, Australia has endured a major drought, and out of that, it has reformed its water rights system and redoubled its commitment to water conservation. So I think if we compare what we're doing on the water conservation front to what those other nations are doing, I think we're going to find that a sobering comparison and be embarrassed by it. And that embarrassment might be a good thing. And hopefully we can embrace and adopt a number of those reforms by the already implemented by countries, other countries around the world.
Good idea. So Norma has a comment or a question.
Norma, I think you're on mute.
Unmute, Norma.
Still can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oh, no sound.
Oh, she just turned it off again. Now?
Oh,
Nope,
no.
it's not working. We'll come back to you, okay? So Tricia asks, how much impact can Biden administration's change in environmental policy have on problems you've outlined?
Oh, I think a great deal. I mean, basically, the fact of the matter is, under our constitutional system, the federal government, if it acts within its scope of its federal powers, can preempt or supersede California state law on most areas related to water policy. So again, for political reasons, it may not choose to do that, particularly since the issue of water allocation traditionally has been left to the individual states to administer, for the most part, not exclusively. We have federal reserved water rights and national forests and tribal Native American tribes, but in general, that's the case. So it has, but in theory, at least, the Biden administration and Congress could do a lot to standardize water policy across the American West. I don't think that will happen. I think it will just be too politically controversial, particularly in the American West. You know, the old adage, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. That's as true today as it was 150 years ago.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I have put this into the chat because it's so important. Petroleum-based plastic is not recyclable. We are burying ourselves in this product. About 99% of what's made of plastic comes from oil, from petroleum. So the idea, well, I don't know what to say about that. But the other thing I wanted to add to the wonderment is farms have been allocated a certain amount of water depending on their production for the past however long they're talking about. And there is this policy about use it or lose it. So you get almond production using up water that they don't really need to produce that stuff. Anyway, now you got that added on.
No, I think that's right, and that's part of that antiquated system of water rights in California and most of the American West through what we call the appropriative water rights context, and that it has embedded in it this use it or lose it principle, and that is anathema to sound conservation practices. So one of the reforms that I would propose is that we incentivize conservation and not penalize water users for it. So it's completely backwards in my view, that use it or lose it principle, which is deeply embedded in California and Western water rights law. We need to modify that, in my opinion. And I agree with you on plastics. Again, I've studied this far more in the ocean environment. I teach ocean and coastal law as well, but it's a huge problem. And yeah, we are choking. Use whatever verb you want. We're choking on our own waste. We're contaminating our nest. It's a big problem, and it's gotten more publicity than it got 20 years ago. but it needs a lot more publicity.
We talk about recycling it as though that's possible. It's not possible.
Yeah, well, it's not possible, and recycling. You know, where do we recycle our stuff that is recyclable? That's another
Yeah,
issue.
yeah.
You know,
We produce too much
China.
of it.
China doesn't want our recycled materials anymore. I don't blame them.
Right. The waste economy is just out of hand.
Right now, we have only about 3 minutes, so maybe we can get through the last two questions.
Last two questions.
Two
Well,
or
I'll have to go for a couple of shorter ones, I guess. Do you think it's feasible to reclaim?
Elise and C. Chen.
I was going to do C. Chen right now. Do you think it's feasible to reclaim wastewater as Singapore is doing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Singapore is another. I didn't mention Singapore, but they have the most rigorous, to the best of my knowledge, most rigorous water conservation recycling program on the planet. So we could learn a lot from them. But again, it's out of crisis comes opportunity, and you've got to build up, you know, the public relations part of it, toilet to tap water. I mean, that's an uncomfortable concept for a lot of people. So a lot of it is public education, and dare I say, benign propaganda to sensitize people to these principles that, again, other nations are utilizing, embracing, and really cutting their water demand.
And then Elsa Mills, are there significant risks of saltwater incursion to our water resources across California besides the risk to the deltas?
Yes, not everywhere. Orange County in Southern California, the Salinas Valley, where I live, we've got saltwater intrusion contaminating our groundwater aquifers here. Southern California, Northern Californians, I know we tend to look down on Southern California in terms of its water usage and water policies. Orange County, I've got to tell you, has been more successful at combating saltwater intrusion and recycling water than any jurisdiction in the state of California. So even here in California, within our borders, we can learn from one another, and we can learn a lot from the successes, particularly when it comes to saltwater contamination of groundwater aquifers from Orange County and some other regions of the state. But that's mainly a coastal phenomenon, not other than the Delta. It's mainly certain areas along the coast where saltwater intrusion is a problem for contaminating freshwater supplies.
Okay, Carol, our time's up.
Yes, it is 9 o'clock. We end promptly at 9. So a rousing thank you to our speakers. This has been terrific conversation tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delightful hour and a half.